I'm sitting at the Hampton Yacht Club with Jim Shoemaker. Jim had a long, successful career as a large shipbuilder. He also got involved with building Hampton One Design sailboats, and we are here today for you to share your shipbuilding experiences. But before we start that, you grew up here in the Hampton Roads. Could you tell us a little bit about growing up here in Hampton?
Jerry, I'd be happy to. Now you probably have to cut me off because I can go on and on about this. Let me tell you first a little bit about the Hampton Yacht Club. Where we are right now, there's been a yacht club here since 1907. It was active up through World War I when it went into disrepair after the First World War, and was restarted in 1927. And Hampton being kind of a unique place, at that time the National Aeronautics, NACA, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, brought a bunch of young engineers to Hampton. That's now NASA. And of course, Nuke Shipbuilding Dry Dock Company was active, so you had shipyard people, you had NACA engineers, and you had local business people who all had an interest in boats in the 20s. Now my dad was one of those first young NACA engineers to come here from Indiana. He knew absolutely nothing about boats, being from the Midwest, but it also turned out it was during Prohibition. So during Prohibition, Hampton Yacht Club was the one place you could hide your liquor. So that was his and the young engineer's incentive to join, and indeed he did. His interest was in motorboats, and at that time Horace Dodge had a motorboat plant over at Newcanoe's Point where he built runabouts. Newcanoe Shipbuilding at that time was starting to build the ships, the famous ships of World War II. The aircraft carrier Ranger was the first one, and we had Yorktown, and Newcanoe's is going on to a long history of building aircraft carriers. So the yacht club, starting in the 20s, there was no small boat racing as we know it today, or even handicap racing as we know it today, but there were log canoes. Hampton had been a seafood town, and the Pocosin canoe, one of the 3 log canoe types on the Chesapeake Bay, was a popular local workboat. Well, boat people, particularly sailboat people, being what they are, you get 2 log canoes and you would have a race. So those were the first boats to be raced at the Hampton Yacht Club in the early 1930s. Sailboat racing was very popular in New England, was starting to become popular on the upper end of the bay at Annapolis and St. Michael's and Oxford and places like that. But the Starboat at that time was one of the most popular boats in New England and on the upper bay. And so we had starboats here at Hampton and at Norfolk. The 3 most prominent clubs at that time were the Norfolk Yacht and Country Club, the Hampton Yacht Club, and the Portsmouth Boat Club. But the Stars, being a keel boat, drawing about 4.5 feet, didn't lend themselves particularly to racing on Hampton Flats, which can go from anywhere from about 3.5 feet of water to 12 feet of water. So the club decided in 1934 that they needed a local design that was affordable, that families could sail, that young people could sail. So they settled on a design which was named the Hampton One Design. It was designed by Vincent Serio, and in 1935 the club commissioned to build 8 wooden Hampton One Designs. And that became the popular One Design class boat before the war in the 30s. Well, World War II had a great effect on the peninsula and on Hampton. And the club grew until the war, and it survived through the war with members. Even it suspended its regatta, I think, in 1942 through the duration. But after the war was a terrific boom time for the club. And the Hampton One Designs grew in just to about, at that time, probably 500 boats that were largely on the bay, mostly on the lower bay. And then with the advent of plywood after the war, the Penguin class and the Mothboat class and various small boats in plywood became popular. Well, given the talents of the Newcanoe shipbuilding people and the NACA engineers, of course, they wanted to build boats. So they built Penguins, was a predominant boat here at Hampton. And in those days, the shipyard tacitly supported various private enterprises around the peninsula. And sure enough, right after the war, around comes a set of what amounted to barges that the club turned into floats to put penguins on. And Harold T. Bent, who was the production manager at the shipyard, was a commodore of the club for 2 or 3 years. And surely the flagpole and the floats and whatever else we have here, how much of it came from the shipyard, Lord only knows. And the talents of the NACA engineers, men like Ray Hooker and Uppy Joyner, people like that, Jack Zanks, who became avid sailors, even though most of them had no connection to pleasure boating before the war, were the spark plugs that made that happen. So in 1950 or 51, the club started a junior program. Well, about that time, I was about 10 years old, and I was just absolutely fascinated with boats, as were all my friends. There was not much else to do in Hampton. It was so hot in the summertime that you gravitated toward the water to do something, and boats were what we did. So a junior program was started at Hampton in about 1951, and the aspiration of most juniors was to have a Penguin-class sailboat, which we either built or bought secondhand or repaired or somehow put together. And of course, the ultimate goal was to have a Hampton 1 design, but none of us reached that goal till we were just about young adults. But anyway, in my particular case, I had an uncle who, my dad died young, and I had an uncle who was an NAC engineer who had bought Hampton 1 design number 34 in 1935, paid $315 for it. Well, by the time I came along, he had sold it. And, but he was a real influence in my life, and so we rehabilitated a Penguin sailboat when I was about 10 years old. Well, you had to scrape it, paint, and at the same time we had a rowboat, and we had to scrape barnacles and replace planks and that kind of thing. Well, I was absolutely fascinated by boat building and the fact that you could do that just was, I thought, the greatest thing I ever saw. And so about 12 years old, I'm out here in Hampton Roads sailing my Penguin one August afternoon. I was about August the 12th. And around Newport News Point comes the USS Forrestal, which was the first big deck carrier built at Newport News. And she's underway on her first sea trial. I had never seen anything like that in my life. And I thought, that's what I want to do when I grow up. I want to work on boats and work in the shipyard and mess with sailboats. And that, so that's kind of all started with messing with boats here at the Hampton Yacht Club. So my parents wanted me to go to college, as most parents do. But 5 days after I graduated from high school, I went to work in the shipyard. My stepfather got me a job which he thought would incentivize me to go to college, and it was a job pulling welding cables, which is about the hottest, hardest, nastiest job you can have in the shipyard. Now, what my folks didn't realize was that I loved it. I thought it was absolutely great, and so there started my shipyard career, and still had a fascination with boats and boat building, and about that time, the transition was being made from wooden boats to fiberglass boats in the early 1960s when I was coming of age. So it's pretty clear to me there was no way I was ever going to have anything bigger than a Penguin unless I built it. So I had two older friends who took me under their wing. They were starting to build fiberglass sailboats. That was David Brown and Eddie Williams. Well, David's family owned a Coca-Cola plant in Newport News, and his brothers were all active sailors. His oldest brother, Ray, being probably one of the premier sailors on the bay in the 1950s and 60s. So David and Eddie started building fiberglass Hampton 1s, and the back of the Coca-Cola plant in downtown Newport News. Well, I joined them in about 1966. We moved to the chicken factory in Fox Hill, which had been a chicken plucking plant out in Fox Hill, where we continued to build Hamptons, and ultimately built about 70 fiberglass Hamptons, and about we built some Chincoteague scows, which were a workboat from the bay.
Now that was Bow Marine.
That was Bow Marine.
What does Bow stand for?
Bow stands for Brown, Oman, and Williams. Waldo Oman was the other principal partner in Bow Marine. Eddie and Waldo both worked at NACA or NASA, and David was family was in the Coca-Cola bottling business, and I was the junior employee, the shipyard design guy. By that time, I'd gone through a training program in the shipyard with the advent of nuclear power is on the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers. So, for the yacht club, fiberglass boats were just an incredible boom. Not only in small boats, Hampton One Designs, we had mob jacks, which were built by Roger Woolman up in Gloucester, skipjacks. The fiberglass boat boom was incredible. And then the Columbia Boat Plant started building Columbia, what was called Columbia yachts, anywhere from 24 feet to 50 feet over in Portsmouth. And very soon, the piers at the Hampton Yacht Club filled up with Morse-class boats, Delta-class boats before that preceded Morse, but fiberglass boats and Morse, boats like the Morgan 24, the Cal 24, the Ranger 26 just took off here in Hampton, and bigger boats also. Columbia 30 and 31, Jack Zanks won the Down the Bay race, and I believe the CBYRA High Point Trophy with Columbia 31 that he sailed for years. And then that just expanded with the IOR fleet, and at that time we probably had maybe 40 slips here at the club. Today we just finished an expansion, and I think we're up to about 125, and so it's just grown phenomenally. Well, the peninsula grew as well, as did most of us who had grown up in the junior program, who I think our oldest junior alumni now is Captain John Hanna, a retired Virginia pilot who was an active sailor on the bays for years. John is, I think, 83 now. His children all grew up sailing down here, but John won numerous High Point trophies. He was one of the first junior members, along with people like Billy Saunders and Chuck Zimmerman, and a lot of them who you could see as past Commodores of the club. Well, my generation was probably 5 or 6 years behind those guys, and we had the benefit of what they'd learned and what our parents' generation had come along. And out of our generation came some excellent sailors. People like Billy Hunt, who was a 9-time National Hampton One Design champion, and just some phenomenal sailors. And people grew not only in as sailors and as Corinthian yachtsmen, but sailing teaches a lot of life skills. And I can't think of anyone who came through that program in the 50s and 60s that didn't go on to have a successful life. In all of the professions, engineering, business people, and I consider it really a kickstart in my life, and character building and that kind of thing. When you're sailing a Penguin and turn it over, you pretty quickly learn to be self-sufficient and as a 10 or 12-year-old kid, and I think that's what sailing teaches young people, and we're still doing that here today with young people. Anyway, my career went on. I trained as a nuclear designer at Newport News Shipbuilding, and at the end of the Enterprise, which was the first ship I had worked on right out of high school, nobody thought nuclear power was going to amount to anything. So Robert McNamara was Secretary of Defense, and he said, nope, the next aircraft carrier is going to be fossil fuel or oil fired, and that's going to be the John F. Kennedy. So At that time, I was a young designer working at Newport News, but again, the benefit in that was the people 20 years older than I was had gone down right after the war to Oak Ridge with Admiral Rickover, and they were the pioneers of nuclear power. And I came under the influence of a number of those people, like Don Kane and Gordon Seckham, who was a member here at the club and sailed for years, and Rogers Lamison, and people who were really the pioneers of nuclear power. Now, I think in most careers, luck's better than skill every time, and that was luck, because I was average. I was an average student in school, and as we started the Nimitz class, I was selected to be the lead designer on the primary coolant system, which is the coolant that cools the reactor and transfers the energy from the reactor to the ship's engines. And I took to it. I took to marine design, and I absolutely loved it. And I stayed at Newport News for 15 years, which time we had finished the USS Nimitz, and she had gone to Norfolk Naval Shipyard for her first overhaul. And I was a member of what was called the Reactor Plant Planning Yard. And so I drew the assignment to go to Norfolk as a representative for the Reactor Plant Planning Yard. Well, did not have a college degree at the time, and at Norfolk, to work in nuclear engineering, you had to have a college degree. Well, Naval Reactors, it was Admiral Rickover's organization, controlled every aspect of the nuclear power program, down to where people were assigned, as strange as it sounds today, from one company to another. Well, Naval Reactors called me up and said, we think you ought to consider going to work for Norfolk Naval Shipyard, which I did. However, not having a college degree, Norfolk was a little reluctant to take me, but they did because Naval Reactors wanted them to. And then Naval Reactors called me up and said, well, we think you ought to go back to engineering school. Now, I thought, well, I'm not even sure I could get into engineering school, much less make it through. Long story short, I did, and that started my career at Norfolk Naval Shipyard, where my whole goal was to go be a nuclear engineer. I never did get to be a nuclear engineer. When I finished my degree, Norfolk said, we need a chief scheduler to schedule overhauls, particularly of aircraft carriers, and you know something about aircraft carriers. Well, I couldn't schedule when to eat lunch, but I was made the chief scheduler. Well, I stayed in that job for 4 or 5 years, and then I went on to be the superintendent of the sheet metal department, and then the superintendent of the pipe department, and then aircraft carrier project manager for the USS George Washington was the first one I did. And I did 4 or 5 of those, and I ended up being the director for aircraft carriers and ultimately the production manager. But a great career. But the thing that struck me in my whole career is that fixing an aircraft carrier was not unlike replacing planks in my rowboat when I was 8 or 10 years old with my uncle, or working on my Penguin sailboat, just bigger. But I had an absolutely fantastic career, and shipyards are a great place to work.
So you worked on the Enterprise as starting out in the shipbuilding industry. Did you ever maintain the Enterprise? Did she ever come back to you, and did you ever have an affection towards her?
The Enterprise, of course, I guess your first ship, perhaps like your first love, is always the one that's in your heart. So Enterprise in about about 2000, maybe 2002, Newport News was full. They couldn't take any extra work, so the Navy said we're going to bring the Enterprise to Norfolk. Well, at that time, I was a director of aircraft carriers at Norfolk, so here comes the Enterprise. Well, we measure the way we do work on ships that large in man days. Well, we were supposed to only have to do 25,000 man days on the Enterprise, and Newport News was going to do the rest. A year and a half and 150,000 man days later, we got the Enterprise underway, and she was off to do another deployment, which she did. Well, 2005, these ships were originally designed for 30 years. So the Enterprise was commissioned in 1961, so that meant she should have been out of service by the mid-1990s. Well, we found out that the nuclear-powered aircraft carriers were literally so well built, and the propulsion plants were so well built, that they would last 50 years instead of 30. So we had a very concentrated program to make sure they lasted 50 years. Well, in 2005, when the Enterprise was 40, I guess 44, 45 years old, she blew up an engine. Enterprise had always been worked on by Newport News, not so much by Norfolk, albeit our experience with her in 2002. So the engine, when I talk about blew up the engine, I'm talking really about the low pressure turbine, which is probably about the size of a good sized truck, weighs about 15,000 pounds. So we had to go look at the engine, see what had happened, and how are we going to fix this thing. Well, Newport News, again, couldn't do it. They were in the middle of refueling the, I believe it was the, probably the Eisenhower at that time, and we at Norfolk, while we didn't need to work, we were the likely place for the work to go. So the Navy says, okay, Norfolk, you're going to do it. Well, it fell to me to be the person in charge of fixing this engine. Well, so I'll never forget it. I got a call, well, how are you going to fix the engine? Well, I went down and looked at this thing, and the engine room is probably the size of the yacht club dining room here. And the engine you had to cut the bulkhead out of the back of the engine room. You had to cut a hole in the hangar deck. You had to cut a hole take out the elevators and haul the engine up. So I went over and looked at it, and there was an admiral, four-star admiral named Bob Natter, who was head of the Atlantic Fleet. And Admiral Natter had been, I believe he'd been a CO of the Enterprise, and he knew a lot about the Enterprise. So Natter had been down and looked at this thing. And so my shipyard commander, Mark Hugel, Admiral Hugel, was away. And so he says, well, I want you to go over and talk to Admiral Natter and his staff about how you're going to fix this thing. So I lay out a plan of what I think it'll take to fix it. And I go over to see Admiral Natter, and there are 16 admirals in the room and me. You know, and I'm nothing but a shipbuilder. So Admiral Natter says, well, how are you going to fix this thing? Well, I laid out my plan to fix it, and this was, it had blown up on Memorial Day weekend. And he said, well, we need that ship back to deploy on August the 15th. And I had laid it out, and I said, well, I can give you the ship back on August the 11th. And he said, well, how do you know that? And I said, well, I've laid out this schedule here that says that. And he said, well, do you need to take the ship to the shipyard? And I said, no. He said, I can fix it at the naval station if you keep me away from change of commands and all the other things that knock off industrial work. And so then he says, can you fix it at sea? And I'm thinking, oh my God, I don't know if I can fix it at sea or not. But it's summertime, and in my youth, I had written a procedure for doing a major nuclear evolution on the Nimitz at sea. So I thought a little while. I said, yeah, I can fix it at sea if you give me times where you won't drive the ship over 5 knots and you won't turn it in circles and got the right sea state and so forth. So he thought I was nuts. He said, okay, tell you what we're going to do. We'll let you fix it at the shipyard, but we want you to do, or at the ship, at the naval base, but we want you to do some evolutions at sea. So we went out to sea, and we cut holes in bulkheads, and we got this thing ready to haul out. Long story short, we were very successful. I told him I could deliver the ship on August the 11th, and I did. Now, what he didn't know is luck's better than skill every time. But we had laid it out. Well, I became a hero in Admiral Natter's eyes. And now, of those 16 admirals, there were a couple that I had worked for. One named Yank Rutherford, who had been the CO of the George Washington when I retired. Yank and I were good friends. He was in the room, and Dale Ball, who had been the CO at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, was a good friend. Well, fortunately, with Dale and Yank, I had people in there who were allies, but working for the United States Navy is great people, and in that case, we were very successful. Got the Enterprise engine back together, and one of the thrills of my career was we took her on trials, engine was working. I was up on the bridge with the CO, middle of the night out off the Virginia Capes doing our sea trials. One of those beautiful nights that you enjoy sailing with stars all out, calm sea, and the CO says, let's see how fast we can get this thing to go. And we cranked her up on all 4 engines. We'd been running her at sea on 3 engines. And off we went at an amazing speed, which I'm not sure is still confidential or not since Enterprise is out. But anyway, very fast. And That was one of the highlights
So
of my career.
that was 45 years after you worked to build it.
Yes, that was 40, well, let's see, this was 2005, 1961, whether 44 years, whatever.
Now, when you went back to it, did you see anything that you did? Did you have any memories from
Oh
it?
yeah, Enterprise is, hadn't changed that much. I mean, there had been some things that had changed, and but not that much. And Enterprise was always the fastest carrier in the fleet. Nimitz class carriers are great, but they're not as powerful as.
Well, it's also the longest aircraft carrier ever built, I believe.
Only by a few feet. I mean, it's very small feet. The Nimitz class is 1098. I think the Enterprise is a shade over 1100 or something like that. But but she's a magnificent ship, as are all of the aircraft carriers. Now I'm partial to aircraft carriers. I will tell you that. So anyway. I was getting close to the end of my career. I turned 65 in 2008, so it was time for me to retire. So I decided I was going to retire. So I told my shipyard commander, it's time for me to go. There was a famous Thomas Jefferson quote about make way for the people coming behind you. It's not good form to hog the job, but I loved the job. I loved what I did. So I decided to retire. And naval actors called me up and said, Shoemaker, what are you going to do when you retire? I said, well, I'm old. I'm going to retire. And they said, well, we're not through with you yet. How about going over to Newport News and help dismantle the Enterprise as we take her out of service? And by the way, you've got some pretty unique experience in project management. How about help set up the government project management team for the USS Ford? So I did that. I went through another 4 or 5 years as a contractor. And thoroughly enjoyed it. I was very sad to dismantle Enterprise, but she served the nation well. She's a real iconic ship in the sense of the people who designed her, built her, and Newport News, the company who is, in my opinion, even though I spent most of my career with the government, the finest shipbuilder in the world. It built her, and so she's now being defueled. She will be taken around to Puget Sound and cut up. Her reactors will be.
Oh, so she won't be a museum ship
No,
somewhere?
no.
or
And the
anything
reason
like
for that is she's a nuclear ship with all of the things that go with radiological controls of a nuclear ship. So her reactors will be cut out of her and buried in the desert, and the ship will be dismantled. Great ship, but there are other great ships on the drawing boards and on the horizon. But it's interesting to me the connection between small boats and boat builders and shipbuilders, because I'm not unique. There are a lot of people just like me in Tidewater who have had very similar experiences of one sort or another in shipbuilding, boat building, and sailing, and so I think there's a connection there. Now, what are we doing now at places like the Hampton Yacht Club? Well, it's interesting. Kids don't seem to own their own boats and want to work on them like we did in the past. But the thing that has blossomed here in Tidewater is high school sailing. We have high school sailing here in Hampton, over at Fort Monroe. They have it at Norfolk, at places like Poquoson, Christchurch, Nansemond, Suffolk. But I have a grandchild that's involved in that, and we went over to run a race last fall, and here were about 100 kids out on the water in 420s racing as high school sailors. But what was more unique than that is there are probably 150 parents on the pier cheering them on. Now, many of these parents didn't have any sailing experience growing up. But I think those skills that you learn, particularly sailing small boats, teach you other life lessons. It certainly did for me and my friends, and I think they will for this generation of kids.
Back to the Hampton 1 design for just a few minutes. It's unique. I did a little research for a yacht club to commission a design for use at that club. Now, there were a few clubs up on Long Island that did that. The International 1 design was one example of that. But the folks here had a need. They found a designer, and they commissioned boats, and it's named after the club.
After the club.
We're talking about the myth that the non-sailing world has of yacht clubs in general. That rich people get together and have very expensive boats and drink champagne all the time and things like this, but nothing could be further from the truth.
Well, that's certainly not my experience, either here or various places around the country I've gone to sail. It's true. You can find people with boats that cost many hundreds of thousands of dollars, and people have the income to support that. But more often than not, you find middle-class people who, in our case here in the Lower Bay, military people, civil service people, who live on a budget just like everybody else. And a good example is my current boat. And between my children and I think we currently have 9 boats, I believe. And mine is Cape Dory 28 powerboat after I moved on from sailing, named Shoestring. Well, every boat I've owned, I owned on a shoestring, and I'm not the only one. And so I think that is a myth. I think boating is available, sailing in particular, small boats is available to everybody. And that's what's so exciting about this high school sailing thing. You see kids who perhaps a generation ago would not have been involved in that, who through the public schools, not just the private schools, but mostly the public schools.
What year is your Cape Dory, by the way?
It's in 1986.
1986.
And we moved to that after sailing Hamptons, and I had, I think, 4 Hamptons, and then J24s.
Well, let's talk about your Hampton campaigning career.
Oh, Hamptons were in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. The Hamptons were the one design boat to
So
sail.
you started racing in the 60s on the Hampton?
I had my first Hampton in 1967. And I raced Hamptons actively every year. I mean, I was eat up with it until 1986 when I moved to J24. It was not unusual at the Hampton Nationals, which we held every weekend, the second weekend in August, every year the second weekend in August, to have 40 Hamptons on the starting line. And that was pretty typical and very competitive fleets and great racing, lots of fun, and they are, in my view, very beautiful boats. And then after doing that for about 20 years, a group of us moved from Hamptons to J24s and did the same thing. We ended up with 40 J24s in a race we called the Radisson Cup right out here on Hampton Flats. The J20, that one design sailing's kind of died out. It appears to be coming back with boats like the Viper and so forth. But the Hamptons were very competitive. It was not unusual to have a 20-boat Hampton fleet racing and have everybody finish within a minute and a half of each other.
And the Hampton fleet is still active somewhat.
Still active fleet.
I think Charlie McCoy is
ending
up.
Charlie McCoy, I first sailed against
Charlie McCoy?
I know Charlie very well. First sailed against him in 1962 when I was crewing on a Hampton, and Charlie won the Hampton Nationals at the Norfolk Yacht Club. But Charlie, matter of fact, as angry as I saw Charlie, was over here, I think it was last year, year before. Charlie's a couple of years older than I am. I think he's about 75 or 76. He's had some health issues, and his cardiologist also sails a Hampton. One of the Stokes boys, I can't remember if I think it's Lane Stokes is the boy's name. Well, blowing like hell, and Lane told Charlie he couldn't sail. I've never seen Charlie so mad in all my life. I thought he'd have a heart attack because he couldn't sail, not because he was going to go out. But Charlie and Eddie Walcott and young Eddie Walcott, who's I think the current Commodore of Norfolk Yacht Club, grew up sailing Hamptons. As a matter of fact, my son, Jamie, is a current Commodore here at Hampton. And they grew up sailing Hamptons together, and somebody's asked the two of them to speak, I don't know, Hampton History Museum or Mariners Museum somewhere here in the next month or so.
Oh, good. On the Hampton One design?
I think just on sailing in general is what Jamie has. He sails a J30 and just won his class in the Down to Bay race in a J30. Now, he grew up sailing lasers and Hamptons and J24, but so it's a generational thing. I mean, he's the third generation. Young Eddie Walcott's a young Eddie. He's 55 probably. And his son has won the national. So it's people tend to stick with it. But but it's not necessarily a money thing.
No, Charlie is still campaigning the same boat. I think
Charlie sailed in the same boat he sailed in 1962.
Calamity Jane?
Calamity Jane.
Yeah.
Wooden a boat built by Mr. Serio in late 50s, early 50s.
And I've seen Charlie race up at Ware River at the Virginia Governor's Cup, and one day it was out there and it was just blowing, howling, and I was on a Mutineer 15 and I was wanting to go back in because I was getting beat around, and Charlie looked so comfortable up on that gunnel.
Charlie has always loved sailing in heavy air. The harder it blew,
He looked so comfortable.
And I don't, thinking back on it, I don't think I ever saw Charlie turn over in the 40 years I sailed with him. I don't think, now the rest of us did, but I don't think I ever saw Charlie turn that boat over. But I think that's pretty typical of the Lower Bay, and probably sailing in general throughout the country. And we've had young people go on from this club. Young Stephen Hunt, who has sailed in the Olympic trials, was one of our juniors. He's now an Etchels sailor, just won the Etchels West Coast in San Diego. Gary Bodie, who is the coach of the U.S. Olympic teams, a product of our junior program. So we've had a lot of very good sailors come through this club, and I think turned out to be very good people, both men and women.
So you give a course at William and Mary about small boats?
Well, I teach a course up at William Mary this is an adult enrichment course called Tidewater Boats, Ships, and Shipyards. And what it does is it traces boats in Tidewater from 1607, the first English boats, up to the present. And we focus on work boats, the seafood industry, small boats and yacht clubs, and of course the naval ships, Nuke Shipbuilding. It's interesting, in 1957, one of the reasons that got me thinking about that course was 57 was the 350th anniversary of Jamestown, and they built 3 replica ships. They gave one to the Norfolk Yacht Club, the Susan Constance, one to the Hampton Yacht Club, which was Godspeed, and one to the Portsmouth Boat Club, which was the Discovery. Well, of course, they gave them the yacht clubs. We had to go race them. And so Ray Brown and Jack Zanks were the skippers of the Godspeed, and out we go to race the Sarah Constant. Well, I was probably 9th or 10th grade, and I have a picture of 3 of my friends and I in the crow's nest of the Godspeed racing out here in Hampton Roads against the Sarah Constant. Well, we could never beat the Sarah Constant because she was a bigger ship, longer water line, till Ray Brown came up with the idea of putting the spinnaker off of one of his boats, a Fleet Wind, on the Sarah Constant, on the Godspeed, and then we beat the Sarah Constant.
Spinnaker? Now, these boats have square sails?
Yeah, but we had a spinnaker that we flew off at full mast, and we indeed won. So it occurred to me, as after I retired, I was looking for something to do, and it occurred to me that people might be interested in that, and it's been very well received. I've been, like I say, I can go on and on about ships and boats, but it's amazing the number of people who we retired up to Williamsburg, who come here from various parts of the country, who have very little idea about the bay, the traditions of the bay. The log canoes, for example. There were 3 distinct types of log canoes on the bay. There was the Pocosin canoe, which was about a 20, 25-foot boat, which was popular here as a work boat, single sail. There was a Pocomoke canoe, which was a twin-masted boat built up at Pocomoke City, Maryland. And there was a Tillman Island canoe, which was which are still raced on the upper end of the bay. And when you think of log canoes, that's typically what you think of. They're 35 or 40 feet, tremendous amount of sail on them, will turn over in a heartbeat. So we talk about those 3 things and the evolution of those boats. And
I recently saw a Pocosin canoe down in Plymouth, North Carolina, at a maritime museum.
There are several still around. There's the Pocosin Maritime Museum has a boat that belonged to Milford Rollins called a canoe, which is about a 110 or 120-year-old canoe that they've got in the museum down there. But Milford raced that boat in the knockabout class here at Hampton as late as 1974-75. I happened to be the race committee chairman of the Hampton Regatta that year, and we had one of those days when it was just howling out of the northwest. And Milford had canoe out on the starting line with about 8 people in it and turned that thing over right on the starting line. And they pushed her up on the LaSalle Avenue on the beach, pumped her out, and out they came back. And but the boat was about, I don't think it was quite 100 years old at that time.
And what we're talking about is a log. Somebody cuts down a tree, a certain type of tree.
Yeah, generally they were pine, and you had different, and they were logs that were scarfed together, and so they were heavy, very thick, and you had, depending on the size of the canoe, you had what was called 3-log, 4-log, 5-log, and I think up to 7-log canoes, where the logs were scarfed together, were sections together. And there are interesting photographs at the Mariners Museum. There was, in the Hampton History Museum, of these things being built in backyards and just about everywhere, all over the lower part of the bay. Same thing on the upper part of it.
So these were work boats initially?
They were initially work boats, and of course, sailors being who they are, they started racing them as in the 30s as work boats. I was fortunate enough to sail on one on the Tillman Island canoe when I was a youngster up at St. Michael's, and they had those particular boats had sliding hiking seats where you would get half a dozen people on a hiking board, and as the boat tacked, the hiking board would come across and you'd get up on the other.
Oh, I see. Like there's an international canoe.
The international canoe, when I'm very different, that's a small boat.
But what I mean, it has that same plank. Is that where that plank came from?
Well, I would think so, because that's where I first saw them, was on
that's
those
interesting,
overhead canoes. And they still race those things up. Matter of fact, Jamie was up for the Down the Bay race, and he said as they sailed into Annapolis Harbor the night before the race, the log canoes were out racing at Annapolis Harbor this year. So they're still around.
So after the log canoes, what would come next as far as, not so much of a work boat, but as a racing boat?
Well, that was the advent. The Star class was started, I believe, in 1911. Star, and then you had a series of small boats that came about in 1930. The Snipe, the Comet, the Olin Stevens was a big, the Lightning was designed by Olin Stevens, I believe, in 1939. And so you had that whole genre was really the start of the small boats. Penguins, moth boats.
And what about the local ones like the Mobjack? That's a kind of a local one?
Mobjack's a local boat. Roger Moorman, Roger was a graduate of the Naval Academy who was, again, somebody who was innovative, a designer, always willing to try the next idea. And he was absolutely fascinated by fiberglass. So about 1954, Roger designed the Mobjack. Now let me back up a little bit. The other prominent yacht club on the Lower Bay was the Fishing Bay Yacht Club, which was up in Deltaville, Virginia. It started in Urbana in 1939, and they moved over to Fishing Bay after the war. Well, there was a hotbed of small boat sailing up in Fishing Bay. With Hamptons right after the war, Penguins, and then they turned to more high-performance boats. Jolly Boat was about 1958 or 59. And then fiberglass came along, and people like Roger and Harry Sindel and people like that were very forward-thinking on glass. Well, Roger designed the Mobjack, which was a self-bailing boat. Self-bailing being a pretty unique concept in 1954-55. Yeah. Because we didn't do the first fiberglass Hamptons with self-bailing until 1961. So it was, Roger was always ahead of his time. Well, he built these Mobjacks, and they really took root up at Fishing Bay. But the Lower Bay, we had some here at Hampton, we had them at Norfolk, had them at Portsmouth, and they were probably the second most popular class behind the Hamptons of that size boat. Roger went on, I think, with Harry Sindel to build boats like the Skipjack, which we had here for a number of years as club boats. And I can't remember the name of that company that they had up on Route 17, but they built a number of early fiberglass boats.
Gloucester Yachts? Or was that later on?
That might have been later. I don't remember what the name of it was. They built Flying Dutchman.
Harry was a Flying Dutchman.
Harry was a Flying Dutchman Olympic sailor, and they built several glass Flying Dutchmen. Joe Hallisey, who was our longtime race committee chairman, had one here at the club. Matter of fact, Hallisey's Dutchman, I was sailing with him on New Year's Day. We had 2 or 3 Dutchmen here that were sailing. This is about 1970, and we're right out there at the point, New Year's Day. No wetsuits. Those were days before wetsuits, and I had on a life jacket and a wool sweater and jeans and foul weather gear, and it's blowing. We're going like hell, and the damn wire breaks on the trapeze. And And I'm looking up through about 4 feet of water, wondering, am I going to bop to the surface with this thing or not? Well, long story short, I did, and of course it was pretty cold, so I came in here. This club was new at that time. Took a hot shower, and all was well. But that's my Flying Dutchman experience off of one of Harry Sindle's Flying Dutchmen. But Roger was a fascinating guy, and there's some of those boats still around.
Yeah, I see him at the Governor's Cup.
Yeah.
The Virginia Governor's Cup up on Ware River.
Yeah, Ware River, and that's probably where the center of them was, up around Fishing Bay and Ware River. A lot of people from Richmond had them. I had a good friend from Richmond who had one. And then it kind of went, glass boats kind of took on a national flavor. We had the laser was the first phenomenon. I don't know how many lasers there are now, probably a couple 100,000.
Well, their sale numbers are
Yeah,
5
yeah,
or 6
on
numbers
and
long
on.
now.
And,
So.
so lasers took off, and boats like the 470 and 420 and boats like that seemed to be interesting one for to me personally is the one we see here now, this Viper, which is a high performance one design boat. But I think we're seeing the trends start to swing back to small boats. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is economic, as we pointed out, that this is not necessarily a rich man's game. Well, I always thought when I was coming along, a new Hampton cost about what a new Chevrolet costs. Well, if I could forego having a new Chevrolet, I could have a new Hampton. And that's probably pretty true today on something like a Viper or something like that. So I think it's all relative, but I think small boats we'll see coming back for that reason.
How about the albacore? Was that built in this area? I've seen big fleets of them.
We've had them here in more recent years. We had them albacores racing here as early as 1973, but they were never active here. They're more active up around Washington and Northern Virginia.
Oh, I
think.
see.
But I don't think there was. I don't think there was ever a fleet on the Lower Bay. But I think the Old Dominion Boat Club there in Alexandria probably had a fleet of them. They were Penguins up there in the 50s, and I think they might have gone to albacores up there because most of them would come from Northern Virginia when they came there.
You were Commodore of this club at one time, and now your son is a current Commodore?
Yeah, I was a Commodore in 1986, and my son Jamie is a Commodore this year.
So does he ask you for advice?
No,
on how to handle-
he's doing his own thing.
Are the issues still the same, do you think, that a Commodore
yeah.
would face?
Yeah, well, the yacht clubs are interesting. They take a progression. Our club originally started on pilings out here, and the clubhouse was built in 1927. Well, in 1970, we either had to do a major renovation or we had to move ashore. So we moved ashore and built this building. Well, there's always a tension in yacht clubs between boats and social members, and in our case, food service. So for years, it was brownback. There was no food service. Then we went to serving sandwiches and ultimately to a restaurant. When we came up here on the beach, and there's still tension between boats and food service, and there's always somebody who wants a swimming pool or a tennis court or whatever. I remember we went down to Charleston racing J24s. In Charleston, I can't remember which one's the Ashley River and the Cooper River, but on the North River, there's this very formal club, very beautiful club right there on the river. Probably doesn't have 10 boats in it, but they had the hoist, so we went over there. That's where we launched our J24. On the South River is a club out on pilots, very much like our club was here. Well, we were down there. The race was being run by the club that was out on pilots, and that night they had a hot dog roast or something and they were telling us, well, our goal here is to move up off of pilings and move up on the bed. Well, wait a minute, don't do that, But so our club, we have kept it a boat club focused on boats, and we're very careful that those of us who have served on nominating committees make sure that the folks who are coming into to the board of directors and to the offices are boat people, that is their focus. But that doesn't mean that we don't, we constantly have tension between getting a cheeseburger here in the lounge that you see and fine dining upstairs. Well, as you can imagine, not much of a fine dining guy, I'm more of a cheeseburger guy. But, so there's constantly that tension, and there's constantly do we have the financial wherewithal to keep this going? Now, we're very fortunate here in Hampton and that our boats in the slip, these 125 boats, basically carry the expense of the
But
club.
there's still a lot of volunteerism, isn't there?
Oh,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, all of our,
especially, I mean, in the earlier days.
yeah, there's still, we have people who have literally dedicated their lives to this club, who keep it going, keep it running. And it's, when I was a Commodore in 1986, our budget was probably $500,000 a year. It's at least 10 times that now, maybe more. And we have grown from a fairly small club to be able to acquire the property on the sides of it. And that's been to the division of volunteers, 3 or 4 people, primarily Phil Briggs and Marshall Finley and Freer Hawkins, which are a combination of engineering talent and contracting talent and legal talent that have allowed us to
Acquire property and expand a little bit.
Yeah, acquire property, expand our our basic peers, but
And make sure it makes financial sense to do that.
exactly. And we've had people that are savvy enough financially to do that. But our great strength is our location right here on the end of the Lower Bay, which is a great place to sail small boats. We've got access to the bay, access to blue water sailing if that's your thing. To cruising into the whole thing.
So the future is bright for the Hampton.
I think it is. I think it is. I think it's bright for boats. It's bright for sailing and powerboating, and I think it's bright for those of us who love boats and have had them intertwined in our lives, for whatever reason.
I just want to go back to fiberglass and resin for a minute. I've tried to work with it, and I think it's an evil, vile concoction. I mean, I've had resin everywhere, and I did a project down in the basement, and I didn't ventilate properly. I thought we'd just go upstairs and won't get up there. My wife almost ran me out of the house because it just went upstairs. So there's a real talent, I think, to working with fiberglass and understanding the resin, and
it's. The answer is yes and no. It's not as hard as mysterious as it appears. Particularly the manufacture, particularly this day and time, stuff like the West system and stuff like that. It's if you follow the instructions, which a lot of us aren't prone to do, it's pretty good.
And that's an epoxy resin. But
that's
you
an
started
epoxy.
with
We started polyester.
Polyester,
yeah, which is the classic fiberglass smell. We had a booth where we would, the basic process for building a fiberglass boat is you build a wooden plug, which is or either you take an existing boat, which is the male plug for the mold. Then you build a mold off of that plug. In my experience, we've actually built a plug that was for that purpose. Then you get the female mold comes off, and then the process is you spray in the gel coat, which is a polyester gel coat, and that's about 0.010 of an inch thick. Then you will lay up the corners of that mold with what we call matte, which is a matte glass, and then come in the case of the Hamptons, we come in with a layer of 10-ounce cloth, and then either a core material of some kind or layers of 24-ounce cloth. And what you do is you wet this cloth out on what we would call the machine, which looks like a big roller that you roll it through a trough, and you pour resin, so you end up with a roll of saturated fiberglass, which you then spread out and you work it into the mold by hand. Now the fumes on a hot day of that can be pretty tough. So you have a big ventilation fan that exits the fumes, but the fumes to polyester resin, if you've ever smelled them, they're unique. It permeates your clothes and your shoes. So generally, the clothes you work in, you would leave at the shop. You wouldn't take home. Matter of fact, I can remember my early days of doing this. I'd take my clothes home. My wife would make me take them off in the garage, and a pair of shoes stuck to the garage floor. That was it. No, you leave that stuff at the shop. And you wake up the next morning. We were building boats. We all had other jobs, so we were working generally from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock at night. You get up in the morning.
So Biomarine was just an accessory.
Yeah, this was a part-time hobby deal. Now David and I would go out at lunchtime. We'd do something at lunchtime, but it was we were pretty obsessed with it. But we ended up you know, we'd work our 40-hour jobs, and then we'd be 10 or 20 hours a week at the shop doing
Wow.
something on the weekends. And that went on for about 20 years. My wife can still get fired up about that.
When you first started, did the traditional wooden boat builders cast
Oh yeah,
anger in your direction?
Well, I wouldn't say anger. Disgust was probably more. Mr. Serio, who we'd all grown up with as kids.
Now, he was the
He was
designer and
he was
builder of the
designer and
original.
builder of the Ham one side. He never quite forgave any of us for building fiberglass boats. And a lot of wooden builders, Mr. Serio never went to class, a lot of wooden builders didn't. There's a very famous builder of down east boats up in Southwest Harbor, a fellow named Ralph Stanley, who built wooden lobster boats. Well, about 15 years ago, when I got interested in this Cape Goy, I was going to design, matter of fact, I did design, I was going to build a combination lobster boat, dead rise boat, and I was going to build it out of glass. So I started going up to down East Maine and looking at boat builders up there, when there are a million little boat builders all over down East Maine. So my wife and I went up, and we went to every boat builder I could get her to go to till she finally rebelled and said no more polyester and resin. And so I went over one morning we were staying at a bed and breakfast across from Mr. Stanley's shop, which was, his house was here, his shop was here, and he was right there on Southwest Harbor. So we went over, and I thought, well, I'd like to go walk around and just see his shop, and having no idea that they would let me in. Well, I had on a shirt, I think it was aircraft carrier one sort or another on the shirt. So I went over and asked, can I walk around and look at the shop? I'm interested in boat building. Well, sure, come on in. So I go in. Well, Mr. Stanley didn't want to talk about boat. He wanted to talk about aircraft carriers. And, but he was an absolute craftsman, but a number of people did go to fiberglass up there. Jarvis Newman probably being the most prolific one. Jarvis built Friendship sloops and lobster boats, and a lot of those boats ended up all up and down the East Coast. Mr. Stanley built wooden boats, so some people did, mostly younger people. By that I mean my age now, but the older people, a lot of them didn't.
In Mr. Serio's case, he was an Italian immigrant, wasn't he?
His family had
immigrated?
come over, and the whole Serio family, most of them had worked in the shipyard. And now whether Mr. Serio ever did or not, I don't know. But I know his brothers and sons and nephews were all in the shipyard, mostly in the electrical trade, and I knew a bunch of them. His son ended up in Richmond. I'm not exactly sure what he did, but Mr. Serio was a craftsman. Billy Hunt worked for him in the summer, and Billy still says, you know, working for Mr. Serio was very methodical, and he said drove Billy crazy because he was very methodical, very slow. And Billy said you knocked off every day at, I guess quitting time was at 5 o'clock. You knocked off at 4 o'clock, and you sharpened tools from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock. So that was the kind of craftsman that he was. And but I think there were a lot of people around like that at that time. You look at the Lauderbachs in Portsmouth, who were wooden boat builders. You look at the log canoe builders. There were lots of people building wooden boats.
Are there any wooden boats being built these days of any type?
A lot of strip plank. This West System strip plank stuff is being done. There's
What do you mean by strip plank?
this is epoxy thin strips where you laminate thin
I
strips
see.
of wood. The Gudgeon brothers who started West System were, there's a fellow named, but most of them are laminates of one sort or another. I don't know of anybody around here who's building pure wooden boats anymore. I think you might see some of it up in, again, around Southwest Harbor. And what's going on up there is not unlike what was going on here in the 20s and 30s, where you'd have somebody who's a waterman, might make his living lobstering in the spring and summer, but he's building boats in a shed in the
Keep them
winter
over
time.
the winter.
Yeah, and matter of fact, I went up there and going down this little country road there, and I think it was Jonesport or one of those little towns up there. And here's this metal Butler building sitting on the side of the road, and here's this about a 35-foot lobster boat. And it's got this goofy looking windshield in the middle of it. I'm trying to figure out what in the world is this thing. Well, just like us down here, they had gotten into racing lobster boats up there. This guy had stuck a 1,000 horsepower engine of some kind in a lobster boat and had this scoop in the center windshield. It scooped in air for this. And so we stopped and talked to him, and, oh yeah, man, I can get this thing go 55 knots or something like that. And so I think there's always people messing with boats. It's,
Oh, yeah.
That kind of thing goes on.
I think that's all I had written down. Anything else that I missed you'd like to discuss?
No, I think we've covered the subject. I thank you for the opportunity.
I thank you.